Hi. Our God word today is found in Romans chapter 6, verse 6, which reads, "Knowing this, that our old self was crucified with him, that our body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to sin, for he who has died is freed from sin." The term that I would like us to look at today is old self. We know this, that our old self was crucified. So the context here again in Romans chapter 6 is baptism, which has a larger context of asking the question, why should we not sin deliberately so that God can be more gracious, or so that God can pour out his grace even more? That was a question that apparently Paul was asked, and if he wasn't directly asked that question, he poses the question rhetorically as though it's something that he's been challenged with in his ministry. That as he explains the grace of God and God pouring out his grace to us abundantly, that the question would arise, well, if God is so gracious and he is so willing to pour out his grace abundantly, why shouldn't we just keep sinning so that he has an opportunity to be gracious, to pour out his grace all the more? And the answer to that question is that we don't continue to sin because we have died to sin. And in order to get to that, we have died to sin, Paul asks another question, assuming that we have some knowledge about baptism. Don't you know that when you were baptized into Christ's death and burial, so that just as he was raised from the dead, you too might have newness of life? So what is it exactly that happens as Christ brings us into his death, burial, and resurrection through baptism? And we find this in verse 6 with this term, old self. Knowing this, that our old self was crucified. We'll look at crucified next time, but we want to understand first this term, old self. What is he talking about here? The old self. Now, this has nothing to do with age. There isn't a firstborn self and then an adolescent self, and then a pubescent self, and then a young adult self, and then a middle-aged self, and then an old self. That's not what he's talking about here. He's talking here about our spiritual nature. And so we go back to the creation. And we see that at the end of the creation, after God had created humanity, he said that creation was very good. We understand from that the first people, Adam and Eve, were good. They had no sin in them, and they were living in perfect fellowship with God. They were tempted, however, and the tempter planted doubt in their minds that God had given them everything they needed. The tempter suggested to them that God was withholding something. And I suppose there is a certain element of truth in that, because the tempter, he's a wily creature. He knows the truth and is able to take the truth and kernels of the truth and twist them to make things sound appealing. God had not revealed evil to Adam and Eve. He had only given them that which was very good. The tempter came to them and said, he's withholding from you, and if you would just disobey him, eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you would have knowledge, like him, of not only good, but also evil. What we understand then, as we look at that event and at the New Testament accounts of what happened as the Holy Spirit revealed particularly to Paul, what this event meant for us, we see that in a way we have inherited from Adam and Eve this brokenness. The brokenness that resulted from their disobedience. And this broken nature is what Paul is referring to here when he says the old self. The old self is the nature into which we are conceived, and we see that maybe primarily in Psalm 51 when David confessed, "In sin did my mother conceive me." But we understand that this is a problem that is ours from the very beginning of our existence. It's not a hereditary, genetic, so to speak, inheritance. It is a spiritual inheritance. We read in the beginning of the 2nd chapter of Ephesians that we are dead in our trespasses and sin, or that we were until Christ came and gave us life. And so what Paul is talking about here, when he uses the term old self, he is talking about the self that was captive to sin, a slave of sin, the old self that has to sin because it's its nature to sin. The old self that we have inherited from Adam and Eve, that desires to disobey God, or maybe in a nuanced way we would say desires to be its own God, desires to run its own life, to choose for itself what it would do without even realizing that the only choice it can make is to disobey. This old self, then, is what dies as Christ invites us to participate in his crucifixion. So we'll look then next time at the word crucifixion and see how it relates and what it is exactly that's happening, because in actuality, in physical actuality, we don't have nails pounded through our hands and feet. We aren't suffocating on a cross. And yet we have this word, crucifixion. And so we'll look at that next week. Just as we see old self here is not a reference to our physical age, but a reference to the old nature which is put to death so that we can receive a new nature. And so then we'll look also at that term as we continue our walk through the letter to the Romans, looking at God words, God terms, theological terms and ideas that help us understand the fellowship into which God has called us. Thank you for being a part of the conversation. God bless you.